Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a little book I just finished listening to on audio called Meeting Melanchthon, written by Scott Keith. This book was put out just a couple of years ago, 2017, as part of the celebration of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And the purpose of this book that Dr. Keith put together is to introduce people to Philip Melanchthon, who is not nearly as well known as his contemporary and friend Martin Luther, but really was a very influential figure in Lutheranism in particular, and just Reformation and Protestant theology in general. So I saw this title on Hoopla, the library kind of audio system that you can get books from, and thought it would be interesting to listen to. So spent some time listening through it and looking forward to sharing my thoughts with you. So the book is 94 pages is all, and it's designed to be a kind of popular introductory book on Philip Melanchthon. Scott Keith, who is a Lutheran writer and the executive director of 1517, which is like a Lutheran theology website, and they have a publishing house. I think they publish different books and things. Was kind of begins the book by talking about how he was teaching a class on Philip Melanchthon at a Lutheran church up in Michigan, and somebody said, "Oh, is there a biography you would recommend for a layperson to just dive into Melanchthon's life?" And Scott Keith said that there really isn't. He said there are books on Melanchthon, but many of them are kind of more scholarly works. There's not really a good popular book, and that's what pushed him to put this project together. So what he tries to do in 94 pages is to both introduce you to Melanchthon as a man, and also to introduce you to Melanchthon's writings a little bit. So I would say about half and half. About the first half of the book, 40 or 50 pages, is the kind of the biographical portion, the story of Melanchthon's life and work, and then the last half is are a number of selections from Melanchthon's writings, most of them from his Loci Communes, which is kind of his systematic theology. In some ways, it's the first Protestant systematic theology. So again, very important not only to understand Melanchthon's writings, but kind of Protestantism as a whole, and certainly gave a lot of shape to the Lutheran tradition moving forward. So I think that's an interesting approach. As I'll talk about, there were some areas where I think the book maybe falls a little short, even of its limited goal. But let me kind of just go through the book a little bit more. So he talks about Melanchthon's life. There were a few interesting facts and things I learned that I did not know about Melanchthon. His father was actually an armor maker by trade and by training, and but was able to bring up his family in kind of a upper middle class life. So Philip Melanchthon had a really good education. His grounding, as is true actually of a number of the reformers, Calvin comes to mind and others, was not really in theology first and foremost, but it was as part of the kind of Renaissance back to the sources movement. So Philip Melanchthon's training and expertise was really in Greek and Latin, and he was a Neo-Latin poet, and very much in the humanities, but had a very sharp mind, very good training, very gifted with words, an amazing grasp of classical sources, and that spilled over into theology as well. He became influenced by Luther's ideas and the ideas of the Protestant Reformation, and when he was teaching at Wittenberg, and of course Martin Luther was as well, and these two men were colleagues who then became friends. Interestingly, when you kind of put Melanchthon and Luther next to each other, they couldn't seem more different, right? Luther is this kind of larger than life, very outgoing, very bombastic, very kind of dominant personality figure, and Melanchthon is the kind of quiet, bookish intellectual. But together they formed a really good team, and Luther, of course, lit a flame that Melanchthon would take up in many ways, and Melanchthon becomes kind of the synthesizer and developer of a lot of Luther's doctrines. So what Luther is kind of preaching and teaching in this dynamic, charismatic way, Melanchthon thinks through and works out far more carefully in many instances. And so the two of them end up having a really good relationship. When they first met, Luther didn't really think a lot of Melanchthon, but later on he would come to recognize his genius and his contributions, and would really value Melanchthon's opinion over and above hardly anyone else's, and viewed his work theologically as being kind of setting the standard. Melanchthon was the primary author of the Augsburg Confession, which is again both very central for Lutheranism because it's one of the confessional documents that Lutherans will use today, but it was also the first Protestant confession kind of widely accepted and used. So it became kind of the classic statement of an early Protestant position, which of course gets developed and articulated in different ways as the Reformation or the Reformed stream and tradition comes into its own. Later Baptist traditions, Anabaptist traditions, all of that is coming at the same time. But the Augsburg Confession has a really important place in the history of not only Lutheranism but Protestantism in general. And Melanchthon's Loci Communes, his kind of systematic study of different doctrines from a Protestant position, was very influential at the time and still well worth reading and working through today. And this book gives you the chance to do a little bit of that, because after going through Melanchthon's biography, talking about his background, talking about his training, talking about his relationship with Luther. Interestingly, even though Luther and Melanchthon kind of became good friends and really valued each other, their wives never got along, and at some points even kind of refused to be in the same room together, which was an interesting thing. I'd not heard that before. But after going through Melanchthon's life, the second part of the book, as I said, are selections from his writings. You can get a taste for those works. I like what Scott Keith was trying to do with the book, and I think this is a fine introduction. However, I walked away feeling a little disappointed in the book. He kind of began with this anecdote of saying there's not really a good popular level biography that you can hand someone on Melanchthon, and I feel like maybe there's still a need for that, because this book fell short of my expectations in a couple of ways. So one would just be 94 pages is not a long time, and to take half of that and devote it to just selections from Melanchthon's writings means that you really have a very short little window into Melanchthon's life, only 40 or 50 pages, and I felt like it wasn't enough to really get to know Melanchthon as a person, as a thinker. And I think the biography that he tries to sketch tries to do too many of those things. Either he could have said, let me just tell the story of his life and introduced you to him as a man, or let me try to assess his theology and his contributions, but he tries to do both, all within about 40 or 50 pages, and I think it's biting off more than he can chew, because what you end up getting is just little snippets into his life, little windows into his theology, his contributions. And of course, if you know anything about Melanchthon, you'll know he's kind of a controversial figure, because even though he's very close to Luther, Luther values him very highly, he's the author of the Augsburg Confession, he goes on to articulate some things regarding justification and so forth that become very controversial within Lutheranism, I think even within Melanchthon's lifetime, but certainly the generation or two afterward. And so he's a figure that a lot of Lutherans who are theologically informed kind of wrestle with. Is he someone that we champion? Is he someone that we critique? He's a complex figure. And Scott Keith kind of points towards some of those debates, but doesn't really go into them enough that an outsider is going to be able to track with them. And I just wondered, kind of what that contributed when you're thinking about a popular level introduction. So that was a frustration for me, that he kind of picked up some of those discussions but didn't have the time to really devote to them to resolve them. And what that also meant was that the biographical sketch you got, there were little interesting tidbits, again, the whole thing of, Luther and Melanchthon's wives not, getting along, but then we don't really find out why that is. We don't really know who Melanchthon is and his personality or as a character. And so I felt like there were points where it was just kind of could I just go read the Wikipedia article and get the kind of biographical overview that I got here? Maybe. So I felt like there would have been more value in kind of a historian's eye coming in and saying, let's explore Melanchthon the man. Let's really meet Melanchthon. And I felt like I didn't quite get that in this book. And part of that may be because this book, I believe, grew out of a series of blog posts or articles that Scott Keith had written about Melanchthon, which were then pulled together into this little book. So I think he had written a series of articles and then said, hey, why don't I pull these together? We'll have a book, and I'll just take, the biographical part from the articles I've already written, and then I'll pull some selections from the loci communes, and we'll put it together, and it'll be this little book that people can get. That's not, invalid, but this should have been better edited, because there's times in the chapters where it references, as we said in a previous article, and it's like, well, okay, you brought this into a book, like do the editing work to make it flow, clean it up. And so there were some clunky kind of signs there. You could see what this had been. And also there was some repetition, from one article to the next, which is appropriate when you're doing these kind of blog posts that are somewhat disconnected. But when you're pulling it together into a book, don't just repeat what you've already written or said, develop it, move it forward further. So it felt like something that was maybe kind of rushed. I don't know the history of how this came together, but maybe it was something that they were wanting to get out for the 500th anniversary, and so they kind of pulled together some existing material and put together this book. And so I felt like what it was trying to do is really a worthy goal, and even the format of saying, here's the biography, here's a taste of his writings, that's a worthy goal, but the execution of it was maybe not quite crisp enough and clear enough. So not a bad book, but I'd maybe give it 3 out of 5 stars kind of thing. So if you don't know anything about Melanchthon, you want to learn a little bit, you want to get a taste of his writings, this is not a bad book to pick up, Meeting Melanchthon by Scott Keith. But I still feel like I'm on the hunt for a good popular level biography of Philip Melanchthon.